Okay, so I'm just going to give you a brief example. So I'm in our digital mouse here, and I just wanted to scroll. I'm going to focus a little bit on a couple pieces from chapter 4 here, the News Titans. This is kind of where we left off, and it's part of our reading for this week. So, in looking at this, one thing that I really wanted to pay attention to was these transitions of how the timeline is progressing, but also looking at art and Vladik's relationship progressing as this novel goes on. This is a pretty stark transition to this chapter here with the News Titans. It's more graphic as well than we've seen before for the literal news. And I'll just point out a couple frames, and this is kind of your goal this week is to pick whatever scenes you like in our readings and to kind of go through them a little bit more. I thought this was interesting. We talked a lot last class and throughout the week about Vladik's his really like strange and obsessive behaviors to some extent and the different levels of that. Here he kind of like berates Art in the beginning scenes for being late because he wanted him to go on the roof and he wanted him to fix this leaky pipe, and now there's not enough time, and Art's pretty much like, I don't know why you won't hire somebody for this, which Vladik does not want to hear about. He says, absolutely not. I will not hire someone to do something that I could do myself. So there's a lot of those stubborn tendencies which we were talking about. And it's interesting because even though their personalities are so very different here, you can even see in the way that Spiegelman draws some of these frames, the way that he has the characters in conversation, framing one another, leaving and entering rooms. It's very, very interesting because it tells a lot, I think, about their relationships too, that they have along the way. And as you transition in here, you have this whole, kind of first page of this chapter, very much, I think, in line with kind of what we've been talking about with this father-son relationship. I like some of the humor that's thrown in here. So for example, Vladik says, like, I gotta pedal, I gotta do this, forget it, like, otherwise I get leg cramps. And Art's talking about, okay, I got this new tape recorder, writing things down is hard. And Vladik asks, how much do you pay for it? And Art says, it was only 75 bucks, it was on sale. And of course, Vladik says, well, you could have got it cheaper. And it's interesting enough to see the moments in here where Art really wants, I think, he bears a lot of the signs of his father's influence, and he does want to please him, but he does very much have these really impossibly like high standards that Vladik is setting up for him as well. So that's something that we want to look at as the story transitions through. And as you go in this chapter, it's a couple of interesting things to notice, because here he wants to keep him on the storyline. Keeping him and recording him is one way that he can really make sure that he can get as much as possible out of his father. And that's another thing. So here it takes us back to Vladik's father-in-law's household. You can see everybody sitting around here. You can see everyone together. It's a large family, the Zyboborg family. You got 12 people in a house together. They all share their responsibilities. And particularly one thing to know, and we'll talk more about this, is the responsibility of the younger generation to care for the older generation. And that's seen in several of these frames right here when you talk about Anya's grandparents, and of course her parents. He was there with Anya and Rishu, kids from other side of the families. So that's really important. It's not necessarily clear. I don't know if the whole family lived together before the war, or if this was something that kind of came out of the war effort here, that it was more of like a comfort thing, that it was a protection thing, so I'm not sure if they lived together before. That was never really kind of said. But you can see here, when you have a lot of people living together, all these 12 people amongst, one household like this, that certainly they're all here in one space experiencing these hardships that kind of go along. So it's really interesting. It's also interesting too to see. Um, I know looking at sort of like the ancestral lines here, kind of going down, I think it's really interesting to see them all kind of interact together. This comment here that it's interesting how Vladik wants the approval and wants the sort of, you know, to fit in with Anya's family. He says, "Ah, grandmother, your stew is even tastier than I remembered. No, it's not like before the war, Vladik. I can't get the foods I need. Each of us gets coupons for 8 ounces of bread a day, and it's a tiny bit of margarine, sugar, and jam per week. That's all. Emphasis on your all here. So how do we manage?" And this is also something really, really true that, we're going to have to look at a lot of these. I don't want to even call them sacrifices because these are some of the consequences of, if you probably remember too, when food is really short, each person's only getting a short amount. The family has enough money to buy goods, and they will do that on the black market, even though that's pretty dangerous for Jews at this time because you are breaking laws, and that's not something that is encouraged. But of course, many people did, and they said, well, we should be happy we're all together with enough to eat. And so you have this constant kind of, struggle back and forth here. Anya's father is not unlike Vladik, at least the Vladik that we get, from later times and from earlier times. He seems pretty pragmatic. He knows that there's going to be really bad times ahead. He's pretty clear-headed. He seems to kind of have an idea of how to get the family through this, and we'll see if that can actually help. Then at the same time, you have this scene here where Wolf, who is Anya's brother-in-law, who's married to her sister, kind of, calling all the men together. They're playing cards. He seems very lighthearted about the war, and he tells Vanek he doesn't think there's reason to worry or save money. He thinks it'll be over. But you can very much see from the frames as they go through, and you can very much tell from sort of the tension on here that Vladek and Anya's father don't seem to believe that. Of course, these are the really early days of the war, so nobody really thought about all the bad things that were going to be coming. So it's hard to sort of judge him in hindsight, for feeling these things. But that's another point to kind of think about. And then some other things to point out in this chapter, Vladek goes into the city. He's trying to find money and ways to earn income for the family. He actually wears his armband that you'll see on here in one of the frames in a second. And here it is, right there. That's the Star of David that identifies him as a Jew. That goes back up, apologies for my scrolling, to the scenes that are right here, prominent in your chapter 4 kind of notes like that, where you're having that transition come over in the image. So he meets Mr. Elzeki, who's a tailor. He used to, sell textiles with him, and they used to do things like that before the war. And these scenes that you can see, I don't want to scroll back here, of, now what Mr. Elzeki has to do is make uniforms for the German officers, but he tells Vladek he can still make suits, he can still get cloth illegally, he can still do things kind of on the side like that. So it's interesting to see, him kind of interact in this way. The Star of David badge did not exist in Poland before Vladek went to the army, and now that's this very sort of feature that is in the day-to-day lives of the Jews living here. And even though things are changing a lot, Vladek is super resourceful. Like, he gets applauded by his father-in-law for his, going out there and trying to earn money and trying to do something. But this also really points out these scenes, how important these personal connections are that Vladek makes, and how useful they will be in the future, too. So, these parts, I remember father-in-law was so happy with me. You see there's at least one smart guy in the family. Interestingly enough. Of course, I only said I got half of what I really made. Otherwise, they wouldn't save anything. So interesting enough too, the way he kind of puts things on the download here. This certainly contributes to his attitudes and to how he gets by and survives today. So I'll just stop here because then you're gonna have Vladik going back out into the streets here. We're gonna talk about the working papers. Working papers confirm that someone's actually holding a employed by a business, and any of those Jewish individuals without papers were seen as not productive members of society and could be deported for any sort of reasons. So that's something that we'll want to talk through. But this is kind of what I want you to do. You pick your own scenes, you pick your own parts here. I just went with this because this was a transition into our next kind of, what we went off of our conversation for this week. And I think a lot of these scenes in the early parts of chapter 4 really help us understand even just the little bits we had previously talked about Vladek. And how he sort of is in his current day and what has kind of contributed to that. So I really look forward to seeing what scenes you pick because I know we have a lot to get through this week, but I think it'll be really helpful for our conversation as we keep moving through Maus.